This lesson is attachment. We're looking at stages of attachment, and this is on paper 1 with social, memory and psychopathology. Just to start, I want us to do a recap. So what I'd like you to do is define attachment from the previous lesson, outline Meltzoff and Moore's research, and tell me what the difference is between interactional synchrony and reciprocity. So this is the second lesson in attachment. Okay, so an attachment is a strong emotional bond between an infant and their caregiver. It's really important that you have the idea that it's a strong emotional bond. Meltzoff and Moore's research was the one where they got infants to imitate facial expressions, and they were testing for interactional synchrony, and they discovered that infants as young as 2 to 3 weeks old actually took part in this interactional synchrony, and they mimicked actions of their caregivers. What's the difference between interactional synchrony and reciprocity? Well, interactional synchrony is mirroring somebody else's actions in time with them, so you're in sync with that person, and reciprocity is being involved in kind of like a conversation, so the infant and caregiver take turns. It was described as kind of like a dance, so one person makes a move and then the other one responds to that in an appropriate way. So today we're going to look at stages of attachment. So this research on stages of attachment was developed by Schaefer and Emerson. And what Schaefer and Emerson did was they did a study, and I'll go through that study in a minute, and they used this study to outline the different stages of attachment that an infant goes through. So here's the case study. So what they wanted to do was observe infant-adult attachments. They had 60 babies of working class families, mainly from Glasgow, and these families were visited by researchers in their own homes every month for their first year, and again when they were 18 months old. So they would ask the mother questions, so the mother would be the observer in this situation. They would ask the mother questions about their baby's behaviour, such as how they reacted when the mother left the room, and that in particular was looking at separation anxiety, and we'll look at that when we look at into a strange situation later on. And they use the information from the mothers to measure different aspects of the infant's attachment. They found that there were 4 stages of attachment behaviour, and these form the basis of their stage theory of attachment. So if you're looking in the textbook or some of your revision guides, there might be a table that details all of their findings. You don't necessarily need the table, and you don't need that much detail, but for some of you it might help, especially if you're aiming for higher grades, just to provide a little bit extra detail. Okay, so these are the stages of attachment. I'll go through each one and explain them. So stage 1 is the asocial stage, and this is from birth to 2 months of age. They found that infants produced a similar response to all objects, so they didn't have a specific response to certain humans, or humans in general, like they would have a similar response to animals as they would to humans. But towards the end of that period, so towards 2 months, they actually showed a preference for social stimuli. So they preferred smiling faces, and they preferred to be around familiar people. And this is because reciprocity and interactional synchrony were beginning to happen. So that's stage 1. The second stage, this is indiscriminate attachment. So this is from 2 months to 7 months, and this is when infants become more social and they prefer humans. They can see which people are familiar and unfamiliar, and they're easily comforted by anyone, but they don't show stranger anxiety. So even though they can distinguish between a parent and someone who they've never met, this person, that they've never met can still comfort them. So they're not worried about being around strangers at this moment in time. So next we have stage 3, and stage 3 is specific attachment. So this is when the infants begin to show separation anxiety. So this is when they get upset when they're not with their primary caregiver or familiar people, and when that person comes back, they're really happy to be with that person. So this happens around 7 months of age. They found that primary attachments went always with the person that they spend the most time with. So if they spend the most time with their mother might not be their primary attachment figure, it might be a grandparent, but that was very rare. Most of the time it was usually the mother that was the primary attachment figure. But they found that it was the quality of the relationship, not quantity. So maybe actually a better explanation of that would be that if the child spent a lot of time in daycare, the daycare provider, that was their key worker, would not be their primary attachment figure. Their primary attachment figure would still be their mother, because their mother would provide a better quality of care. So, and they would have a better quality relationship with their mother. So that would mean that they would have that attachment with her. Fathers weren't very often the sole object of attachment, but in 3% of cases, fathers were the primary attachment figure. But this was rare. And that links into the role of the father lesson. And then we have stage 4. This is multiple attachments. So this is from 8 months onwards. So this is when an infant develops more attachments with a range of different people that they have consistent relationships with. So if they're going to daycare all of the time, they will develop an attachment to that care worker that's looking after them in daycare. Or if they're going to grandparents very often, or aunties, uncles, even fathers as well, they can count as multiple attachment figures. So if the mother's been the primary source of attachment up until this point, from 8 months onwards, that infant would have a stronger attachment to other individuals such as the father. And these attachments are called secondary attachments. So they would have primary attachment to that caregiver, which they've developed and which they prefer in the earlier stages, and now they're developing secondary attachments. So these are people that they're okay with, that they don't have stranger anxiety with, that they're happy to be around. So you see that by the age of 1 year, the majority of infants had 78% of the infants had developed multiple attachments. Okay, so just to recap what we've done so far, there's 4 stages. The first one is asocial. This is where they have the same response to all objects, but towards the end they prefer familiar people. Then the second stage is indiscriminate, and this is when infants are more social, but again they prefer familiar faces. Then we have specific attachment, and this is where an infant starts to develop separation anxiety, so around 7 months, and this is when they get upset when their primary caregiver leaves, and they feel joy when they return. And then we have multiple attachments, which is our 4th stage, and this is when they start to develop secondary attachments. So these are multiple attachments to other individuals, like grandparents, siblings, fathers, if the mother's been their primary attachment figure. And 78% of infants around 1 year had a secondary attachment. So there are stages of attachment, and that's the basis of this. And most exam questions that have been asked already ask you to recount the stages, to name some of the stages, to give some detail about some of the stages. So make sure that you're aware of all of the 4 stages. You're aware of roundabouts when the stages happen, and you have an idea of some of the key things that happen in each of the stages. So now we've got some evaluation points. So we've got some strengths. So the research has good external validity. So because it was done in their own home and the mothers were the observers, it means that it was in a natural setting, so it wasn't artificial like Meltzoff and Moore. It was in a natural setting, and the parents were not distracted by the researchers. There weren't as many demand characteristics. So for example, if they'd have just had a researcher stood in the corner of their home or cameras in their home, it might have made them behave in a different way. Because this didn't happen, there'd be less demand characteristics and less investigator effects also. And another good thing is the application of this research to real world. So if we're looking at the stages and we know that around 7 months separation anxiety happens, then daycare providers can use this information to help them. So if you have a child that's starting daycare around that age, or from that point onwards when separation anxiety occurs on a regular basis, you would take small steps and you would have a phased entry, so they could familiarise themselves with the new adults and they could start to develop those multiple attachments also. So you make sure that they would have a consistent key worker, so they would develop a multiple attachment, a secondary attachment with that key worker, and you're not swapping and changing too often, so they become familiar with the people that are caring for them. When it says a phased entry, it would be just like they would go to nursery initially or daycare initially with their parent for a whole session, then the parent will be there for half a session, then the parent would leave the child for half a session, and then eventually you'd work up to the child being there with the daycare providers. Then we have some limitations. So the data relies on self-reports. The mothers are the observers, so they might say things to make themselves look better or to make them their child look better. Like, oh yes, they're fine with other people and they're happy when they're with their grandparents, they don't cry when I leave them, that kind of stuff. So because of this there's issues. Also the data's retrospective as well. I haven't used that word, but you can use that in that first point. It's retrospective, so the mothers might misremember the information, and it might not be very accurate, the data that they're giving us. The sample was biased as well because it was done on working class individuals, so it's difficult to generalise this to modern day infants, especially because it was done in the 1960s where mothers were primarily staying at home and caring for their infants because the female workforce wasn't as big as it is these days. So it could be that we've got more stay-at-home dads now, so if we did the research again now, we might find that infants have multiple attachments earlier on. Or we might find that fathers are more likely, so more than 3% are more likely to be primary attachment figures. So you could actually use the idea of temporal validity there as well. So you could say that maybe it lacks temporal validity because of the era in which it was conducted. Then we have this idea that Schaefer and Emerson don't actually say the significance of each attachment. So when we're talking about the earlier attachments in the second stage and the third stage, when they start to show separation anxiety, those earlier attachments, are they more important than the secondary attachments? So we're not really aware of that. So they don't really go into much specific detail. They just tell us the stages, but they don't tell us which stages are important or why those stages are important also. So just to recap. Good things are external validity, natural situation, less investigator effects, less demand characteristics. Another good thing is application, so we can apply it to real life. Daycare can use it to make sure that infants are comfortable, make sure they develop those multiple attachments because they have a consistent key worker and they become familiar with the people that are caring for them, and also we can manage separation anxiety also. Negatives, generalizability or temporal validity. Can't really apply it to modern day parenting. bias and desirability might be a problem because mothers are the observers, but also you've got the idea that the data is retrospective, so it might be inaccurate. And also it's not specific enough, so it doesn't go into enough detail about the significance of each attachment type. So finally, I've got some exam practice questions. These are methods-based questions. I tried to find some questions that related to the stages of attachment, but most of them that I've been asked so far have just been to name a stage of attachment or a multiple choice question on stages of attachment. They haven't really gone into a lot of detail and a lot of depth, which is something to be aware of. But there's a lot of methods-based questions on this topic area, so I've got some methods exam questions for you to have a go at. And it's always helpful to do research methods anyway. So have a read of this. It's 6 marks, so because it's a methods question, it'll take you a little bit longer to read it, so maybe a maximum of 10 minutes on this question. So have a go at that, and then I'll go through the mark scheme. Okay, so here's our mark scheme. So the first question, we must operationalise the behaviour. Some behavioural categories could be crying, clinging to mother, smiling, playing independently. So you have to give a specific behavioural category. You can't just say like being happy with the mum. You have to specifically say a behavioural category. This question might have been easier later on when we look at Ainsworth and the strange situation, but you might have an idea already, so you might have put like crying or smiling. The second question, you could use time sampling, you could use CCTV, you could tick a box when the behaviour is shown. 1 mark if it's brief, and then your second mark for your elaboration, so the example there. Draw a table and tick the boxes when the behaviour occurs. For example, when the child cries, this should be marked as 1 occurrence, something like that for 2 marks. And then the final question, a pilot study was to check that cameras are positioned correctly, or to check that the behavioural categories are appropriate, and to operationalise those behavioural categories. You might have some other ideas, but basically the idea of a pilot study is to check our methodology and be aware of anything that needs to be changed. So you could say like to make sure that the observation period is the right length of time. Because we're looking at babies, you might want to make it shorter or longer, so we could use a pilot study to check that the observation period of time is appropriate. Okay, so this week we've got 3 attachment lessons. So we've got caregiver-infant interaction, stages of attachment, and then role of the father. So there are 3 lessons for this week. When you've done these 3 lessons, you go and do the quiz on Classroom for this week, and then we'll continue with attachment the following week.